Okay, so now we're on the segment having to do with learning context. Um, the success of any training program um, depends on certain principles that are based on instructional design issues, um, like whether all the activities were developed and coordinated to support the trainees' learning processes or not. Um, the elements of this process are things like, okay, what am I trying to teach these trainees? What exactly do I want them to learn from this training? So, and that sounds, again, a lot of this training stuff sounds like, well, no, duh. If you've been efficiently trained or you've had good teachers or things like that, a lot of this seems really easy and seamless. But when you're trying to train someone or you're trying to set up a class or something like that, you have to spend some time trying to figure out, okay, what is the ultimate goal of what I'm going to say or do or teach, right? Like why are we here? And that's step one. What am I trying to teach? And for college classes, it's usually something cognitive, right? I'm trying to get you to remember something. I'm trying to get you to understand a concept, something like that as a teacher. And in a lot of jobs, it's also like that. As the trainer, I might want you to understand the principles of our industry or something like that. There are also psychomotor learning tasks, like learning to manipulate these switches or twisting these knobs in a certain sequence or how to weld or things like that. Those are psychomotor tasks where there's coordination, there's focus, these kinds of things. And then there are also social elements that might need to be learned. How to do customer service, how to de-escalate a hostage situation. I mean, things like that. So there are different elements of what we might be training that are going to have an effect on how we design our class or our training. Another element to be considered about how we're going to design the instructional setup is, are the trainees going to be evaluated immediately on whether they actually acquired these skills during the training, or are we going to train them and then just turn them loose and it'll just be basically employment evaluation or not. So planned evaluation is another aspect. So what am I trying to teach, and then how am I going to know whether you learned it or not, is really what we're talking about with instructional design. Another factor that contributes to the success of a training program would be the characteristics of the trainee and the trainer. Things that the trainee brings with them that might affect whether this trainee really acquires the skills or not would be things like, are they really ready to learn this material or learn this new skill? Sometimes you're lacking something in your past. Maybe your language skills aren't up to par, or you don't have enough experience to be confident enough to learn this next new step in the process, or something like that. Like you're not really ready. Maybe you don't feel confident. Self-efficacy talks about whether you feel like you have the skills that you need to be successful in this situation. So you, as a learner, might have self-efficacy about college, but then you might not have self-efficacy about the work world, something like that. That's talking about your self-confidence, about your ability to succeed in this context. Motivation to learn. I'm endlessly surprised by how many people really just don't want to stick new information in their head. They really just want to get by with the bare minimum information in their head at any time. It's like they have a concept of their brain like it'll fill up or something. And if I put a bunch of dry things I have to learn from my industrial and organizational psych class into this space, then I'm not going to have room for the more fascinating things like lines from movies or whatever I find motivating and interesting to learn. Just as a student, I'd like to point out for you guys that your brain does not fill up. Your memories are held in synapses that form between your neurons. You have plenty of space. You're never going to fill up. Go ahead and absorb stuff like a sponge. But some trainees are more motivated to learn than others are. And so that's going to affect whether they actually learn or not. Trainer characteristics are things like the specific objective that the trainer has when they come to the training session. Hopefully their specific objective is to impart the information. But let's be honest, teachers and trainers have cross purposes sometimes where they have other objectives like being liked or being feared or being viewed as in charge or other factors that have nothing to do with learning and really about their own ego or personality or things like that. And so if the trainer has some other, oftentimes unconscious, objective at work, it may interfere with their effectiveness. The trainer's understanding that different people learn in different ways. And so if a trainer figures, all I have to do is tell you and then you'll remember it, and doesn't realize that not everybody learns well auditorily. Not everybody learns well one trial. If they don't understand that a person's attention span is limited, and so the trainee might be motivated, the trainee might be ready and feel confident about their ability to learn, but they're fatigued. You can only pay attention for so long, right? If a trainer recognizes those things, they're going to be more effective because they're going to change up the way that they teach things and break things up into smaller bits and all sorts of things that will help to make the material more memorable in the long run. And then of course communication skills. If you are that teacher from Ferris Bueller's Day Out, Bueller, probably not going to be as effective as a more dynamic instructor who actually communicates well, communicates in a way that attracts the attention of the learner, that is clear, concise, as devoid as possible of filler words like ums and uhs and things that make people start to tune out, those kinds of things. If they pick up on the body language of their learners, all these kinds of communication skills that some people have and some people don't, affect whether the learner is actually going to pick up what the trainer is trying to convey. And then finally, the last thing on my list about trainers is whether they're flexible in their strategy. If the instructor comes in assuming that this is how it's going to go, and no matter what else is going on, people could be falling asleep, I'm still going to stick to this strategy. I'm going to stick with it, even as I have a learner saying to me, I'm having difficulty with this material. Too bad, sticking to this material. This is my strategy and I'm sticking to it. Those kinds of inflexible strategies are not going to lead to good outcomes in the long run. A trainer who can change up and roll with the punches and sort of adapt based on who's there and that kind of thing is going to do a much better job. Finally, we have just basic principles of learning that are going to have an impact on whether the training program is successful or not. And some training developers don't take these factors into consideration. So I thought it would be important to sort of talk about, what is learning? See that first word? This is the definition that comes from way in psychology's antiquity. A relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience or practice. See that first phrase, relatively permanent change? The assumption is that if you have learned something, you will be basically forever changed as a function of it. So this is a good time to point out that the scores that you get on exams in class are not evidence of learning as defined by psychology. Your scores that you get on tests are evidence of memory, is what we're testing in those classes. Memory is much more transitory than learning is. Learning should be relatively permanent, and it should be a function of experience or practice. And that's sort of what the purpose of a training session is, right? To teach you basically a set of behaviors that should be relatively permanent. By the time you've been doing them for a while, you should be able to sort of do them in your sleep, right? So, basic principles of learning. Okay, so I've got all these little headers. Okay, on the far left here, we've got active learning. One basic principle of learning is that when the learner is actively involved in the process, they are going to encode the material better. They're going to remember it better, and that's going to transfer over into learning, relatively permanent change in their behavior. So having the trainees actually engage in the behaviors that are part of the job is going to make a much more memorable, long-lasting, relatively permanent change in their behavior. Okay, what about, should we teach the whole job right now, or should we give you little parts at a time? Should we meter it out? Well, it kind of depends on what kind of job you're going to be doing. you should train the whole job when the job is a very highly organized, really coherent, you know, group of tasks that are independent, freestanding tasks. You got to teach that whole thing because there's nothing to break down. It's like coherent, it's organized, it's got to be done in this sequence, or else you're not really understanding the job. So those kinds of tasks have to be taught really sort of as a set, one whole event. And one training session might be devoted to that entire set of behaviors that must be done in its entirety in order for the task to have been completed. It's more effective to teach parts when you have like really complex behaviors that really it's going to overwhelm the integration system of the brain to learn all the little tiny details and parts all at one time. So break it up. Break really complex tasks up into smaller tasks. This is easier when you have tasks that are easily divided. Some tasks are easier to break up than others. If it's really coherent, highly organized, you're going to have to teach the whole thing no matter how complex it is. But if it can be broken up and it's a really complex task, it's better to do part. I was thinking about when I used to teach dance, and for me, I just wanted to teach them like the whole move at one time. But one of the things I had to learn was to break it down. Because to me, like pas de bourrée, shuffle, ball, change seemed like all one thing. But the truth is you've got what your feet are doing, what your hands are doing, what your hips are doing. And the first thing you want to do is focus on the feet and then throw in other stuff later, right? Break it down into smaller parts when it's a complex task that can be divided, right? Now, leaps, you can't break down because it's sort of like you got to do the leap. Sort of like, this is what you're going to have to do. It's a whole, and you sort of have to do it. So some aspects of dance you have to teach as a whole, but other parts can be broken down. And so it's kind of like that for any job. Some things you're just going to have to bully your way through it and learn the whole thing all at one time. Others we can break it down, especially those things that are complex, and break downable. Should the training session be all at once, or should you have multiple sessions of training? Now, this is an interesting question. There really are two kinds of materials that really we want to talk about. If we're trying to teach you how to organize, if we're trying to teach you something and we're trying to be efficient for the organization, if we're trying to minimize costs for the organization, it's going to be best to do the masked technique, where we go ahead and just sit all the trainees down. We teach them everything they need to know in this one sitting, and then they go to work. That's the most efficient, cost-effective way from the organization's perspective. But based on research, the best way to actually change a person's behavior is to do distributed learning, especially if it's something that you want them to know over the long term. Now, one argument that organizations will make is that if I can just get them to know it a little bit, the on-the-job repetition will really solidify it over time. So if you have behaviors that it's okay if they make a couple of mistakes on the job, it's not a huge thing. I was just at Subway today and they had a new guy in, and he didn't know the difference between whole wheat and the honey oat. And I'm sure he was trained. Obviously they must have shown him which bread was which before they put him on the line. But he didn't, when it came down to it, and one of us ordered whole wheat, one of us ordered the honey oat, he was like, oh no. It kind of doesn't matter, right? He can say which one's which to his coworker, or he could pull out the one and we go, oh wait, that's the honey wheat, that's mine. It's not a crisis. So why sit a person down and train them until they've got competence when they can kind of make these little mistakes on the job? It's not a crisis. Okay. On the other hand, there are certain jobs where you kind of have to get it right the first time. Like, for example, surgery, right? Like, when you come and operate on my brain, I'd like you to do it right the first time. There's really no room for messing it up. So what do they do when training surgeons? Distribute the training. across med school, across residency. Well, they do an internship first. I mean, over years and years of reading about it, practicing on cadavers, watching it be done on a live person, assisting on a live person, and then finally getting to do it, right? That's distributed training. And that's really what you do when you have a behavior that needs to be mastered before you are placed on the job. So distributed is the best when you really need it to be learned. Mass is so efficient for the organization, and it's an okay thing to do if it really doesn't matter if they're perfect when they hit the job. Okay, meaningfulness. People learn better when the material is meaningful. So one of the things that can aid in the meaningfulness of the training materials is to do an overview of, sort of map out what we're going to be talking about in this training session, so that the learner is prepared, kind of ready. They know that you're leading towards something. They also know that there's a conclusion to it. This is not going to go on endlessly. I know when you get to that topic, we're almost done. You guys know this as students who take 4-hour classes in the evening. Having a little warning of when we're going to stop is really helpful, and it really helps to motivate the learner and things like that. Another thing that boosts meaningfulness is if you use examples that are really relevant to the job. So anytime the trainer can possibly integrate an example of when this principle went wrong on the job, or that an employee had a really effective use of the training technique and really, it helped them in their job or whatever. Those kinds of things are going to be much more meaningful and memorable for the learners. And then, of course, sequence the material logically. That, one of the things that aids in learning is organizing the material in some fashion, so that the learner can kind of make a hook on the material and organize it in their brain in a way that it's more retrievable in the long run. And so if you want to help make the material more meaningful, you can kind of go from one topic logically into the next topic, logically into the next topic, and it makes it a lot easier for the learner to understand. Now, the next principle of learning is practice and overlearning. Opportunities to practice new skills are really important. When a person is, just learning how to do something, they need to practice, and then practice some more. In fact, I really wanted to emphasize the importance of overlearning. Continuing to practice after you think you've mastered the skill. Because what can actually happen is if you keep practicing, you can take what starts off as an effortful task and convert it into a task that can be done without any effort, without any attention. And that allows you to be more flexible in the execution of that behavior in the long run. So practicing to the point of overlearning is a really good strategy, and it also makes the material really resistant to fading. You'll probably remember it forever once you've really, truly overlearned something. So I want you guys to think about, for example, anytime you were ever in a play or a musical performance or a dance performance or something like that, and you practiced, and at first you really you were struggling in practice because tenuous hold on the sequence of things that needed to be done, and then you got to the point where you mastered it. And then if you had a coach like mine, you continued to practice well beyond the point of mastery. You continued practicing until you kind of lost your enthusiasm for this particular behavior, whatever it was. And pretty soon you were sort of doing not that enthusiastic of a job. But then when you were placed in front of an audience, the energy of the audience caused you to perform better than you ever had in practice. That's the best benefit of overlearning, is that you've mastered the skill to the point where even though you're nervous, or even though you're under stress, or even though you're tired, you can still perform the task at your optimal level. In fact, you might perform it better than you would if you weren't under stress or you weren't tired or whatever. So practicing to the point of overlearning is a really great strategy. Now, unfortunately, for most companies, they can't afford to have us practice to the point of overlearning. So what they do is have us practice to the point of, bare competence, and then put us on the job, and then the job allows us to over-practice. But there are certain jobs where you want maybe a little automaticity to your response. You're able to do the behavior without even having to decide whether it's the appropriate behavior or not. Like, for example, anybody who's taken first aid training knows that one of the things they advise you to do is to take training all the time so that these responses become automatic. You don't even have to think about what the right response is. That's what firefighters and police officers do. That's what, anybody who is in charge of making decisions under stress. They practice to the point of overlearning. It's one of the reasons why people in the military spend 8 weeks in basic training. They're overlearning their responses. Okay. Our final category of principles would be pertaining to feedback. What kind of results report are you going to get as the learner? Oh, I forgot I had subpoints under practice and overlearning. So there those are. Okay. So the purposes of feedback are to, give the learner an opportunity to adjust their future behaviors. If you don't get feedback, a lot of times you think you're doing it right. And so the feedback allows you to say, oh, geez, I need to alter this or that about my behavior and do a better job in the long run. Getting feedback also motivates us. We want to get good feedback. We want to avoid negative feedback. Some of us are reward seekers and some of us are punishment avoiders. But either way, knowing that we're going to get some kind of feedback will alter our behavior as we're striving to either, seek out reward or avoid punishment, right? So we want to learn and do our best. And then feedback also allows us to recognize any shortcomings and set goals for improving our performance. If we're made aware of something that wasn't ideal, then we can focus on that, put our effort into that behavior. Now, for a trainer, there are certain principles that they should follow for delivering feedback. For one, feedback needs to be as immediate as it can be following the behavior. It's always more meaningful. We always talk about if your dog has left a puddle in the house, there's no point in punishing them if you don't catch them in the act because they don't learn from. The thing is, it's not just dogs. None of us learn that well if there's a long delay between the behavior and the feedback. Partly because we start to self-justify. Maybe we're aware of the shortcoming in our behavior, but we start to think of all the reasons why actually, and you know what, in retrospect, my behavior makes perfect sense. And now that you're criticizing it, I don't like it. Whereas immediately following the behavior, we might have been more open to that kind of feedback. Feedback needs to be frequent. We've talked about this in class before. Waiting an entire year between performance evaluations is not very helpful. It's hard to give immediate feedback if you're not giving frequent feedback. So the feedback needs to be frequent, and it also needs to, here's another area where there's shortcomings. A lot of times, managers or trainers or teachers focus on the negative, telling the learner how to change their behavior instead of trying to balance it with some positives. These are the things I like, and these are the things you need to work on. The feedback needs to be delivered sensitively, but also clearly. Sometimes trainers don't want to give any bad news, and so they try and hem and haw and dance around the issues. But, if you want your learner to change their behavior, you've got to be clear about which aspects were undesirable. You can do that sensitively. You don't have to say mean things. You don't have to be harsh in order to be clear. You just need to be clear and kind. So sometimes trainers need to be trained how to do that stuff, but it's all doable. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and in the next segment, we'll come back and talk about how learning things in one context can be transferred to another context.